Welcome to What's Best Forum's Masters and Makers interview series. Today we are speaking with a rising star in the loudspeaker field, Ken Songer of Songer Audio. Ken, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Ron. I'm glad to be here.
So tell me a little bit about Songer Audio, the organization. Are you a one-man band? Do you have people working with you?
I would be remiss if I didn't credit my wife as a partner with me in Songer Audio in terms of the design, research, development, the development of the driver and the loudspeakers. And now that I'm getting around to it, the website, the marketing materials, really the entire thing has been a one-man band. But my wife, has been just absolutely essential in running the nuts and bolts of the business and making sure the wheels stay on the bus, and and helping out as we've gone to these first few shows, exhibiting around the country with the loudspeakers. So yeah, I would say we're a partnership of two,
That's
and
great.
it's
How did you
quite an
come to
adventure.
conclude that how did you come to conclude that field coil drivers are something special in the first place?
That's kind of an interesting story, really. I mean, it started out as a creative passion, really. I think I've come at loudspeakers from somewhat of an atypical angle, in the sense that my background isn't in engineering, or really, I think what a lot of people would say were fields that would have predicted the kind of success that we've had over this past year. I studied drawing and sculpture when I was younger, and graduated in design, and I think that brought me with somewhat of a unique perspective coming into this sort of work. But returning to your question, a part of that fascination, that creative fascination, for me, was the need to build the entire loudspeaker by hand from scratch. And I think part of that was because, since I was a teenager, I had spent quite a bit of time it's tinkering around with loudspeakers, making loudspeakers of my own, and doing that, based on factory parts. And something about that process. I mean, not that is just objectively an inauthentic experience, but for me, it felt inauthentic. It wasn't really going to feel like a fully actualized pursuit for me unless I built the entire thing. And that, of course, was going to include the magnet,
Did,
which,
did you
please.
design the entire driver yourself? Did you work with a consultant, or how did the
It's
exact design come into being?
there. I designed and built the entire thing myself, but here, much like crediting my wife, I'd be remiss not to give a lot of credit to the unbelievable community of people out there online, who were a part of that. There were some really foundational readings that I did, some of them through long forums of people who were exploring the same kind of pursuits that I was. And inevitably, as is the case with any long development process like this, there are places where you get stuck along the way. You don't know quite what the path is to take. And when I reached those points, there was always somebody out there who had the acumen that I needed, to push to the next level. And they're just too numerous to credit. So yeah,
Do
please.
do you physically fabricate each of the pieces, the parts of the field coil driver?
Not physically. I mean, in the sense that the motor steel, the low
Mhm,
carbon steel
mhm.
that has to be milled in order to make those motor housings. I do all of the design work.
Mhm.
It's the magnetic circuit is all modeled in the digital space. Everything is modeled in the digital space first. But as far as performing the actual milling myself, no, the way that that's done is through a collective of mills that I don't know. I mean, it's amazing what's become available to small manufacturers like me in this day and age. I mean, we live in a wonderful and terrible age, in the sense that there are so many benefits that we get out of the fact that these manufacturing processes that even 10 years ago were completely unachievable for a little guy like me are now available and actually pretty affordable. So, there's that milling process, which would have been unachievable.
In other words, you have vendors or subcontractors that actually fabricate the pieces.
They fabricate some portions of it. So,
Okay.
and that's really just the metal work. That's really where that line is drawn. So when you look at that driver and you see the housing, that is being fabricated by a professional mill and
Hmm.
plated.
Hmm.
And then the all those parts of that beautiful frame are being water jet cut by a local shop here in town that does a really great job with that. But then finishing all of that, doing the finishing on the motor, doing all the sanding and polishing on the frame parts, that's all done in-house. And then every other part of the driver is 100% hand constructed, and none of that is done
So
by
you physically assemble the
others.
speakers yourself once
I
those
do.
parts are brought to you. Okay, okay.
I love doing it, actually. It's a wonderful.
Now you had a
uh,
big career at Microsoft, so is this just a fun passion project for you, or how are you viewing this business?
Well, I actually I wasn't at Microsoft. I hate to correct, but I did do some work for Microsoft, and I was, I went through a lot of doors in my software career. And that spanned a little over 20 years. I guess I want to say 22, 23 years. It was a long career, successful career. So it was difficult to walk away from that. It wasn't a passion project, really. I mean, it was in the sense that I certainly brought an enormous amount of passion to it, but it really was a compulsion. I mean, it was a calling. I mean, there's just no other way to put it. I just couldn't drown it out at some point. I mean, I'd reached a point where I was dreaming about it. And when you reach that kind of level where the calling is that loud, I just had to have some heart-to-heart conversations with my wife about what I was doing with my life, and it was actually coincidental with a health scare that I had, and those two things in combination, just that was the perfect storm that was powerful enough to drive me out of software and into doing something that I really love doing.
And
Uh,
how did you learn the technical and engineering aspects of audio, magnetics, wire, crossover, driver design, speaker design, woodworking?
Uh, well, I don't know. I guess part of that would be underperformance in my software job. I just found myself, spending less and less time putting my energy, into software and advancing myself as a software engineer, and more time into truly thousands and thousands of hours of research. I mean, I just couldn't get enough of it.
Hmm.
And so at any moment that I was not required to be writing a piece of code or in a meeting, I was sneaking away into conference rooms and studying all of this stuff. And I mean, you're right, all of those disciplines are not insignificant. I mean,
No.
there's nobody who is more surprised that I've been able to do this than me.
What
Go ahead.
wood do you use for the cabinets?
I've worked in quite a few. I mean, the ones that I guess I would make a short list of my favorites have been, and this all depends on, I guess there's the aesthetic component to it, but also, woods bring a different, each one brings a different tone,
Hmm.
into the outcome of a loudspeaker like this one. Um, and while it's not dominant, it is a factor to consider. And so I've worked in cherry, sapele, Santos mahogany, which is also called balsamo. It's a wonderful wood. It has this beautiful aroma when you work it, but it's used in flooring a lot. It's a very dense, dimensionally rigid wood that is perfect as far as I'm concerned for doing this kind of work. And then the other one, which has to be my favorite, is African rosewood, or bubinga. It's just a sensationally beautiful wood. It has a wonderful tone to it. It's very dense. It has high mass, and it's a pleasure to mill it. So yeah, that's my favorite, I think.
So do you prescribe the wood, or do you allow the prospective customer to select a particular wood from which you will fabricate the cabinet?
I always allow my customers to select
Oh,
the wood.
well,
Yeah.
how do you guide them as to the different sounds of different woods? What questions do you ask them to help you figure out what would be the best cabinet wood for them?
I guess I kind of try to simplify that conversation. And, I mean, you'd think that a lot of the conversation might center around, the tone of the loudspeaker, in the end. But I'm able to avoid a lot of that conversation, which I think is kind of a good thing, in the sense that, I mean, for me, just from a philosophical standpoint, or, my point of view as a designer, that character that's brought to the listening experience by the cabinet, it shouldn't be entirely absent, but it should be almost entirely absent. So, there are a lot of designers who, for very valid reasons, produce very lively cabinets. They celebrate the resonance of whatever the material is used in their loudspeaker design. And I actually thought I was going to be that guy. I thought I was absolutely going to be somebody who very much wanted the expression of sound to be something that was very characteristic of myself and my own point of view. But what I ended up discovering is that I want very little of that in the listening experience. So I go to great pains to almost entirely deaden the cabinet. The S1 is where that really comes into play. The S2 is its own animal. It's a very unusual speaker, but with the S1, it's very meticulously lined and treated on the inside. At the mid cabinet, it has a further layer of cotton lining on the inside to further reduce resonance in it. So, I mean, as I'm guiding them, I'm telling them that they're really that, it's really pretty subtle in the outcome of how the S1 sounds, what the wood is that's been used in it. But I usually guide them towards something that's going to carry high mass. Like with cherry wood, it's going to resonate. It's going to be warmer in the mid range. Vocals and string instruments are going to sound a little bit richer and fuller.
Mhm.
As my experience has been that as you get towards denser, more dimensionally rigid materials, that accentuation is going to uh, tend more towards the treble region in the frequency response of the loudspeaker. But again, that shouldn't be, at least for me, a dominant factor. I kind of guide them towards making aesthetic choices. What kind of woods do you like?
Okay,
What's your listening room?
so cherry might be a little bit warmer.
Yeah,
A denser wood might be absent that a little bit additional warmth, but you're saying actually
yeah.
it's primarily an aesthetic issue.
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, for me, it is anyway. And again, that isn't to say that it necessarily should be, or that it is for every
Mhm.
loudspeaker designer. I think that there are a lot of great designers out there who celebrate those different tone woods
Mhm.
and what they bring to the listening experience. And I think that speaks to, just your point of view as a designer, in the sense that I think some designers feel that in a more, well, I think it's inescapable that the last musician on stage is the speaker for any musical presentation. And knowing that that's the case, it may be that musician plays quite a lot. They play quite a lot, they bring a lot to it. And a lively cabinet, I think, would be a fine example of that. But it may be that musician plays next to nothing. The one thing that is common between them, though, is that last musician is essential
Mhm.
to the experience of music for the listener. And for me, that last musician on stage doesn't play a whole lot. They play very little. I try to leave very little evidence of myself in that final experience. I think it should be something that's left to the listener.
In your development process for the field coil driver, how did you select the metal for the frame of the driver?
It was for a heat benefit. The frame, each one of these things that go into the driver. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they all appear to have been purely aesthetic decisions. I'm just putting fancy trousers on, what is otherwise a very ordinary thing. But the real truth of it is that the basis for each one of the things that you see in the driver was grounded in a purpose. And then and the purpose of that frame was the fact that the motor over time as it's running. I mean, it's called a motor because that's really what it is. And as it sits there running for a long period of time, it generates heat. And as it's generating heat, because there is such a very fine tolerance in the magnetic gap where the voice coil is sitting, it's only about the thickness of a dollar bill, so it's very, very fine. And as that motor heats, if you haven't addressed the heat or controlled it well enough, you can run into problems where that voice coil is no longer operating properly in that very fine tolerance. So aluminum was chosen as a heat sink because it's an excellent material for that. The reason why you see the frame arms running down along the sides of the motor is exactly for that purpose. And it does an even better job at that than I expected it would. So if you walk up to the S1 or the S2 while it's been playing for quite a while, and you just feel the flange of the driver, there's quite a bit of heat there. But that's great. That means that it's wicking it all away from the motor, which is exactly what it's supposed to be doing, and then dissipating it into the air.
So the frame is aluminum?
It is, yep. It's
Okay.
aluminum. It has a brass face on it, but otherwise it's solid aluminum.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because it looks kind of like a polished nickel or something.
Well, I put a lot of effort into polishing it. Actually, but you're absolutely right about the motor itself, and that may be why the whole thing appears to be all of one metal type. The motors, the steel motors. I mean, I don't know if you may have read this as I'm documenting my journey on the What's Best forum, but you do end up discovering that no matter how much effort you put into polishing and sealing raw steel, it will rust. There's just no way around it. And then the thing to decide there was what kind of coating to put on it, and it turned out that nickel had a really beneficial effect in terms of the inductance of the driver that was unexpected. So that turned out to be what that material is, and that may be why the whole thing looks like nickel, because actually a good portion of the body of it is.
What is your philosophy or sonic objective that you are trying to achieve for your customers? Your speakers go into a customer system. What do you want them to experience? What is your sonic objective for them? What
You
are you
know,
trying to achieve for them sonically?
yeah, I think it's been such an interesting experience, Ron, over this past year, going to uh, the shows and exhibiting and seeing people react to the work. I think I've discovered that, over time, what that is. And I don't think that it was a fully refined vision when we went to our first show at the Pacific Audio Fest. I don't know that I've fully actualized what that experience is that I'm trying to give somebody. After seeing how people reacted to the work at the Pacific Audio Fest last July, I went back into another heavy cycle of development and refinement of the voicing of the speakers based on that. So, I think what I was after in the beginning, the experience that I thought I wanted to offer, was one of just stark neutrality from end to end in the experience. And I slavishly pursued that. As I was trying to voice the speakers and making design decisions about the driver and all of it. But what I ended up discovering is that what I wanted to offer people was balance and musicality. And it's that last word that's the most important. The greatest compliment that I can ever receive for my work, and that I have received over this past year, has been that the speakers sound so musical. I mean, that for me, how can a loudspeaker designer ever expect to hear a greater compliment than that?
Well,
Really.
one greater compliment might be it sounds like Walt Disney Hall is in my room. So that's what I'm trying to understand. I mean, neutrality and musicality are sort of like audiophile terms. What are you philosophically trying to create for your customer in his or her listening room?
Um,
Do you think of it in terms of traditional audiophile sonic attributes, neutrality or musicality and transparency and uh,
Yeah,
quiet background, or do you think in more holistic emotional gestalt terms?
that I actually in the development process, I think in terms of all of that common vernacular that you're talking about, balance, neutrality, how well do they image, I mean, and data measurements, all of that stuff goes into that experience. And you would think that in the end, that what I'm trying to arrive at from a philosophical standpoint, is a piece of technical wizardry. You know what I mean? But I mean, there are two kind of ways from a philosophical perspective that I think people can have that listening experience. And it can be, for me anyway, either an encounter with science or an encounter with art.
Hmm.
And which one am I trying to produce philosophically? It's an encounter with art.
Hmm.
I mean, I'm not trying to say that there's anything wrong with the loudspeaker as as the former of the two, but once all of that work has been done and a loudspeaker has reached a point where there is no obvious impediment to it achieving excellence on all of those different levels, loudspeaker design goes from being a science into purely an art form.
Hmm.
It goes from being what is at its outset for me. I mean, and an outset in the sense that it's the effort to develop a fixed point in space by which I can make decisions and know where I'm going as I continue to develop the speaker. And that for me is measuring it for flat response 50 inches away on axis and going for a particular kind of response that I'm looking for, which is flat and tilted slightly up.
Hmm.
That's where I start. And
Hmm.
then once I've achieved that point, which is no small feat, it's then the effort of trying to produce what is perceived to be an absolutely immersive experience from the listening position. That's all that matters. And that was the difference between what I thought I was trying to achieve as I started out in this debut year, and then a few months later, how it had changed, based on the fact that I was fully embracing that that was really the goal. And there are nuances that go into that. Like, for example, when you're in any room and you're listening to a speaker, what is underappreciated, I think, often is that you're sitting in a speaker. The speaker itself is a speaker, and you're in the cabinet, and
Hmm.
that entire cabinet is resonating, and it's doing it in such a manner that makes any sort of resonance coming from the loudspeaker a rounding error by comparison. And the room is such a huge influence on that experience.
Hmm.
And in order, and if that isn't accounted for, in a same manner as like admitting that as a law of physics, you have to account for sound diffraction off of the baffle. It has to be accounted for. I mean, it may sound great to say that there's nothing but wire between the amp and the speaker, but it's a missed opportunity. It's a missed opportunity in the sense that physics predicts something, and why wouldn't you want to address that? It's the same thing when you're looking at that frequency response. The room is going to resonate, and in a common room it's going to resonate at a particular frequency range, and because it does, the right thing to try to achieve, in my own point of view, is a little bit of a dip in the frequency response where the room is going to be playing a part in that, and that extends throughout the frequency range, for me. So none of those technical terms, in other words, should ever intrude upon the experience. What I mean by a musical experience is that, while, yeah, if you really stop and think about what's happening, you'll notice that the speaker happens to be imaging really well. But if you're having that experience the way that I want you to have it, you forget about all of that because you're riveted by what you're hearing. That's really the point of it. And for me, how I define that sense of having a musical speaker as opposed to, whatever other adjective.
Back to the design. Why a whizzer cone? How can a whizzer cone have the transparency of, say, a ribbon tweeter on the one hand, or the smoothness and refinement of a soft dome tweeter on the other hand?
It was really around the need for phase coherency for me. That was the reason behind that decision. Um, I think that if there is one thing in the listening experience that is grossly under indexed, it's phase.
Hmm.
So I mean, as our primitive brains have developed, over time. I mean, of course, frequency response is the most predictive of a good listening experience. But I mean, when we were still living in caves and there was the very real possibility we might be devoured by a lion, it was really important to know where that lion was, in space. And the thing that allows that to happen in the brain is phase. And it's less easy to articulate, what it's like when it's wrong. But when it is wrong, it, the brain knows it, the sound just doesn't, it's not involving, I mean, even though it may be covering the frequency range and doing a spectacular job of doing that, if the phase is wrong, it's still going to be, a lesser listening experience. And the wizard allowed me to do the point source. It allowed me to do one single full range point source, which, from that phase perspective is about as good as you could ever hope to do.
So you, in other words, a separate tweeter would not allow you to achieve the phase response and coherency that you want.
Not without being somebody else, I think. And by that I mean, if I was Wilson Audio and I had the, no doubt spectacular resources available to, to achieve that kind of, phase coherency that they strive for in a multi-way design, then maybe that would have been something that I would have entertained. But for me, and this really is, Ron. I mean, it's all throughout everything that I make. It's all about simplicity and not overcomplicating anything.
Mhm.
I mean, if it's possible to achieve phase coherency through a multi-way, but the the clear way to do it
Mhm.
is through a point source, then for me, there's no contest. The point source is really the way to go. And that's, yeah. And then it was just a matter of trying to overcome the not insignificant design challenges of producing something that was full range
Mhm.
with just a single driver. That was really the difficulty of it.
What do you hear as the sonic benefits of the open baffle design of the S2?
It's they're very different listening experiences. That's another thing that's been fascinating to watch as people experience the speakers. The sonic benefit of it, if I were just to say it in one single sentence, would be the music sounds live. So I mean, when I'm trying to guide people and they wonder, what is the difference between these two speakers and how they sound, as I'm trying to put that into just, pedestrian terms, I tell them that, I mean, if you want to know every last little scintilla of what the recording engineer put into a recording, the S1 is the speaker for you. I mean, you won't miss anything. Every absolute micro detail is going to be there and you'll be able to appreciate it. However, if you're willing to sacrifice a tiny bit of that and feel like you were literally in the studio when they played it, that's the S2 is the speaker for you.
Mhm.
It gives you that amazing sense of energy in the room, as though the performers are really truly right there in front of you.
So that's how you would help a customer decide whether the S1 or the S2 is the right speaker for him or her.
Absolutely, yeah, and or if they bring a strong preference
Mm.
into that conversation, I don't like to grade the experiences of audiophiles. I mean, as heretical as it sounds, I don't think that many of us in the end are really after an objectively, neutral
Mhm.
experience. I think that we're after something that's very, very personal. And while there may be a great deal of balance or neutrality, within that experience, it's different for each one of us. And so if somebody describes himself as a huge open baffle fan, I just accept that at face value, and then have a conversation with them about the S2 and what it's capable of doing, what their listening room is like, what kind of gear they have, and what kind of music they like to listen to. I mean, all of it plays a part. In
Are you considering any significantly larger format speaker, perhaps an S2 Ultimate, where I'm imagining two field
Yeah.
coil drivers in parallel with the woofer on top and a woofer on the bottom in like a 5.5, 6 foot tall cabinet?
I am working on that. That's funny that you mentioned that, Ron. Yeah, I'm working on the S3 right now.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, so that will be. I mean, I don't know. It's probably too far to say that it's a cost no object loudspeaker, but it certainly is a statement.
Who is
Um,
Wammerdine and what's your relationship with them and how did you come to have them make your power supplies?
it was really just it was serendipity. I mean, I had signed up for the Pacific Audio Fest, and and even though the speakers had been in small engagements put out into the public sphere, and I'd received all kinds of just incredible feedback on them, so I had every reason to feel confident that was going to be a great experience for everybody. I was suffering from serious imposter syndrome, which I think is pretty common for anyone who feels like they're the dog that's finally caught the car, which is how I felt.
Hmm.
But as I was kind of in that period, I went out to the Pacific Audio Fest lists of exhibitors and noticed that there was this guy who was making magnificent 2A3 amplifiers just to the south of me in Wilsonville. So I reached out to him and said, "Hey, I'm a new guy on the scene, making what I think is a pretty special loudspeaker, and if you don't have a dance partner for the show, well, I mean, we should talk." And that led me to Pat Hickman, just a wonderful guy. He's at the heart of Wammerdine, and we were fast friends. I brought the loudspeaker driver down, and yeah, we tried it. We probably shouldn't have done this, but we tried it out in these big pure audio project quintets, just to see what it could do, in his listening room, and that was a magnificent experience. And they were just hooked. Himself and his partner in Wammerdine, Matt Kamna, who was just I don't know if anybody really knows Matt is such a genius, but he really is just a truly brilliant human being. But the two of them together they just adopted me. They just decided that the speaker was so good that they wanted to be a part of it, and it re-energized them actually to make some new amplifier designs. But in doing that, they recognized, like I did, how important the power supply is to the sound
Hmm.
of the field coil driver, and they took it on as a personal project for free
Hmm.
and just developed the original prototypes for me, and they sounded absolutely amazing. And they've been working with us ever since. It's been a really successful partnership, and I consider them good friends.
What type of amplifier do you think sounds best on your speakers?
You
Do you
know,
prefer
that's
a tube amplifier?
I do, but that's turned into somewhat of a more interesting conversation, really. I had what may have been an incomplete understanding of the output stages of amplifiers, which is no big wonder. I mean, in the sense that, for me to have achieved what I've been able to achieve as a loudspeaker designer, I mean, I've gone as deep as I can go in one direction, and then I'm shallow everywhere else. And so, I mean, if you're looking to me to describe amplifier topologies, I'm just not the guy to do it. But um but my understanding had been that in the output stage of a tube amplifier, as the impedance of a full range driver goes up, in other words, as a point source has to operate over its entire impedance range, you have a concern there with how the output stage of the amplifier addresses the increasing impedance. And in the case of a tube amplifier, it puts out more power to that higher impedance, and that gives you a more balanced presentation. Whereas in a solid state amplifier, where it's a it's a I mean, I think that the right pairing for that, if my understanding of amplifier output stages is right, is a multi-way, multi-way that is operating within its own ideal impedance range. Um, but I've been led to, and the reason for that is because it puts out less power into higher impedance,
Mhm.
giving you a less balanced presentation. But I've been led to believe in recent conversations with Alberto of AGD Designs. I was just speaking with him in Italy, actually, just a few days ago. He was giving me a bit of an education in that regard. That's only really the case when the power supply of a solid state amplifier is not well designed, and in a well designed power supply, it too will put out greater power into a higher impedance. And so he's actually sending me a model, and I'm really excited to try it. It's this new GANFET amplifiers, and hopefully they're going to be an amazing match for the speaker, and that's going to wake me up to the whole world of solid state amplification for the S1. That would be great.
While you were developing the speaker and testing different designs, what turntable tone arm and cartridge did you use?
None.
Oh,
Yeah, I've never been a vinyl guy, Ron.
Okay.
I hate to say that, and it's not due to any kind of prejudice of any sort. You know, I just the you know the path of least resistance for me was digital formats,
Okay.
and so that's where all of the design and development has been happening. You know, but of course it's early on, and a lot of the people who have visited you know, over the course of this past year and heard the speakers, apparently long to hear them on vinyl. They feel that they'll be just a beautiful match with a good vinyl rig. So I share their anticipation. I'm looking forward to knowing what that experience is like myself.
What's going on in your research and development department? What's the next new project we should expect from you?
You know, I there are a few things I suppose. You know, one of them, as I was mentioning, is the S3 loudspeaker. I'm
Mhm.
going to keep that close to the vest for now, but it should be spectacular. You know, as you were mentioning, it's going to call into duty more than one pair of the field coil drivers.
Mhm.
And yeah, I mean, even as much as I love the S2, it's a wonderful speaker. You know, something that had a little bit more resources thrown at it, and turned out to be something more along the lines of a line array of those field coil
Mhm.
drivers would be unbeatable. I mean, I just can't think of any listening experience that could top that. So that's kind of the direction I'm heading in terms of the S3's development. As far as development of the driver, the V4 version of the driver, I'm looking into cryogenic treatments, deep
Mhm.
cryogenic treatment of both the solenoid and the motor. That offers a lot of potential in terms of increasing the strength of that field coil motor. I mean, it's already a very strong magnet at 1.7 Tesla, but I mean, if I can hit 2 Tesla with that thing,
Mhm.
I mean, it's just going to sound like it's not of this earth. And deep cryogenic treatment may be able to offer that. So that's where I'm at for research and development at the moment.
That all sounds very exciting, Ken.
Yeah, it does to me
Thanks
too.
very much for joining me here.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Ron. Thanks so much for the opportunity. It's been great talking with you.
The pleasure's mine. And if you've enjoyed this interview, please kindly subscribe to the What's Best Forum YouTube channel. Thank you.